Hello, y'all, and welcome to your semi-annual episode of the Heathen Bitches podcast. This time, cast from a hurricane. Ooh. I'm your host, Glade. I got here my friend Sig.
Hey.
And my friend Fish.
Hey, I'm Fish.
And we got a special guest, Ingwine.
Yo.
Did I say your name right?
You did.
Holy shit, that's the
Applause.
first Old English thing I said. Maybe it's not even Old English. I don't know what it is.
It's Old English.
Yeah, I don't know how to speak. Ingwine here is a Anglo-Saxon heathen, and actually, why don't you describe yourself?
Okay, I'm an Old English heathen, among other things. I'm a Germanic Philologist, which means I do languagey bits with old stuff, especially Germanic languages. I do other language stuff too. And I have opinions, which is what we're here to talk about today. Opinions on what?
Something.
Wait, plug your stream.
What's the topic?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Don't you try and segue.
Oh, no.
That's our job.
See, I need to work here a little longer before I'm allowed to segue. So, yeah, I have a stream. I am Grimm's Lawyer, double M, Grimm's Lawyer on Twitch and on YouTube. I do streams where we read old stuff in the original language and talk about it. Don't worry, you don't have to know old languages to participate. I will translate stuff if it needs translating, and we just kind of meme around the old stuff. But yeah, the point is to make reading original sources fun and engaging and be silly. And this area of the year, where it's spooky season, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, we are reading some Middle English ghost-related stuff. So definitely stop on by, check out Grimm's Lawyer. But yeah, that's my plug. I'm going to unplug now.
There will be links in the description to his stream, as well as all our usual shit. As per usual.
So today's topic is not a very important topic. It's one of the least controversial topics in all of heathenry, like across the board. We're talking about Ettins, also Jötnar and Thurs. We've all got different takes. Actually, me, Fishy, and Sig have pretty unified takes, I feel like. And then we have no clue what Ingwine's take is.
We are the enlightened centrists of this topic.
Yes, that is true. We are the enlightened centrists of heathenry. It pains us, but it's true.
I know, I hate being a son.
Why? You get the best of both worlds. Take it out. I don't know how that song goes. The fucking Miley Cyrus one? Or is it Hannah Montana? I can never tell.
I think that's the point.
That's actually the point of that one fucking song, isn't it? You get the best of both worlds. Fuck centrism. Anyway, take a side. I say this before I'm about to be a centrist.
Okay, so first, maybe we should probably define what the fuck we mean by, Etten and Thurs and all that kind of shit.
Yeah. Fishy, why don't you go first?
Well, I was going to say the usual takes are either a being of like primordial kind of, a lot of people liken it to like weather, so like hurricanes, wildfires, and things like that. Or B, something that is like an anti-god in a way that is opposed to everything the gods do, that is bad for humanity. So like a demon in a sort of way. But I don't think we agree completely with either of those.
And then C.
C is
Giants.
giant, which is a bad translation, and we should ignore it.
Yeah.
Love bad translations here.
Etten actually translates... I'm going to be saying it with a glottal stop the entire episode, by the way, because I think it's just fun. Etten, it translates closer to, like, devourer or eater. Same thing with Jötnar. Can I get a confirmation from our resident philologist?
I'm waiting, because I have a lot to say about that. We'll get there. But
oh,
yeah,
okay.
You're not.
I guess I'm
You're
right.
not disagreed with by all scholars, so you have a check
In
mark.
Beowulf,
Yay!
how do you say his name? Seamus Heaney?
Yeah.
Seamus Heaney, yeah.
He translates it
Seamus.
as ogre.
As does. Oh wait, no. Tolkien translates elves as ogre. Anyway, continue.
Which is weird. I don't know.
That's
how
a weird
you...
take for Tolkien, but okay.
He doesn't want them to be grouped with. He doesn't want elves to be grouped with the others, so he hides the fact that it says elf in the Old English. That's my take on that.
And yet Feanor is out here being an absolute bastard. Yeah, good, sure, Tolkien.
Yet again, my lack of knowledge about Tolkien proves me to be based. Yeah, so those are the common takes on Ettin. Why don't we describe our takes on what Ettin are, or Jotun, or Thurs?
I think my take is kind of, it's something that isn't necessarily aligned with, like, the job the gods do, which is, you know, good for maintaining the order of the universe, but doesn't necessarily go against it. I mean, it may. So it's a pretty broad category.
Yeah, about the same. Like, you have, you know, obviously categories are absolute bullshit, and if you stick around with us long enough, you will learn how much categories should be taken out back and shot. But by and large, like, the Ettin is, yeah, there's something that's not necessarily within the quote-unquote pantheon of gods, but they're also not necessarily, like, in all, like, violent, hostile little devils. They can vary between, like, being just neutral and not wanting to be really interacted with much to being full-on bastards, which you probably start seeing titles like Thurs get applied to the latter bunch. In that same vein of, I don't think they're necessarily all, like, just another group of divine beings. I also don't think they're, like, any sort of truly anti, mostly because I just don't think that the idea of being anti-existence is logical and really functioning as a thing.
Yeah, and then my take is this, because I'm Norse, so I have funky words. Jotun, I think, is a categorizational tool that really should just describe spirits or deities with, like, a destructive nature as opposed to a creative nature. Typically the Aesir have, like, a creative kind of domain, and then beings like Logi, wildfire, destructive, doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's destructive. Destructive can be good. Destruction is part of construction. Otherwise, you'd have no materials to do things, right? You'd have used it all up. So, yeah, the idea that they're all, like, the beings of primordial chaos prepared to destroy the world and act against the gods, I don't vibe with that. And then Thurs would be the beings, particularly Jotun, who may not be as what's the word? Not opposed to the gods, but may not have your best intentions in mind, because I don't rule that out as a possibility. So things that you can have a praxis with, but you may not want to. It may not be advisable. Not to say that you can't have a praxis with them, but it's like something where it's like, use your best judgment.
Use your brain, numbskulls.
And I think I'm not going to speak for Ingwine, but I think the three of us are in agreement that it's not a species. So, like, Odin being descended from Jotun doesn't mean that he is part of Jotun necessarily. It's more of a delineation.
It's like a job description, right? Everyone is hired. Everyone at Amazon is Amazon worker, but some Amazon worker are warehouse section Z. Some Amazon worker are piss bottle section. Some Amazon worker are drone repair. You know, fuck Amazon. Yeah.
Amazon, the real Thurs.
And you know, if I'm a box at Amazon, I might really want to have a good relationship with the drone repair guy. I don't necessarily need to interact with the piss bottle guy, you know? I feel like we're gonna get some negative response from, like, people who are Thursitru. I don't hate you. I have no qualms with your praxis. I really don't. This is just how I see things. You're free to do whatever the fuck you want.
Yeah, standard disclaimer, we're just bitching. Literally. That is the name of the podcast. We bitch. If you have any problems with us bitching, you may counter bitch. I don't give a shit.
I think before we get too far into this, let's hear Ingwine's take on what is in Ettin.
Okay. So yeah, I actually do align with a lot of what you guys said. I just have a lot to add as well. I definitely based in unison. Excellent. Yeah, I think it's much more of a description of a relationship than a, species I think that tracks, especially because we see the fluidity of how it is applied to, or not applied to, individual entities in our sources. Certain, what we would call gods, especially in the Norse pantheon, are sometimes called Jotuns and sometimes not. And sometimes it's like there's some kind of evidence that they are related to someone else who's called a Jotun, but other times it just depends on the source. I also feel that there is definitely a fluidity in what it means in the different sources and through time as well. The only individual Eoten that we get in Old English, Eoten being the Old English word for, it's the Old English source of the word Etten. The only individual we get is Grendel in Beowulf. And
Grendel and his mom.
His mom is notably not called an
Grendel's
Eoten.
mom has got it going on. She's all I want. No, okay, sorry.
Yeah, no, she is not called an Eoten anywhere in the text. It's just Grendel. There are more uses of the term Eoten in Beowulf. Most of them, if they're not sort of in that ambiguous place where we're not sure if they mean Jute, the tribe, or not, because there's some confusion about certain instances where it could be an ethnic term for like a group of people. Aside from those, all of the examples of it in Beowulf are in reference to swords that were crafted. They're called Aldswag Eotenas. There are 3 instances of this in Beowulf, and it just means old Ettinish sword. And Beowulf uses one. I think it's the other 2 are Wiglaf and Eanmund in Beowulf, who use Aldswag Eotenas, an Ettinish sword. Another word that gets brought up in Old English is gigant, which is from the Latin word gigans, ultimately from Greek gigas. But this also comes up in Beowulf. One of the places where we see an Aldswag Eotenas, it is also called giganta Jowerk, a giantish craft of giants. This is kind of what seems to be a variant of another sort of formula that means craft of the giants. It's Enta Jowerk, which shows up in Beowulf 3 times, and it shows up in Andreas, the Ruin, the Wanderer, and the Cotton Maxims. Those are all different Old English poems. And in all of those other poems, aside from Beowulf, it refers to Roman ruins. So what we get in most of these cases where we have the word ent and gigant used in poetry, they're referring to craftsmen. Even the word Eoten refers to craftsmen in those instances where we have swords made by Eotenas. So if there is a part of the role that Eoten refers to in Old English, at least part of the role seems to have been someone who has made some kind of arcane craft. We also see this with the word ent and gigant in other sources in Old English, especially biblical sources. The figure Nimrod, who's credited with making the Tower of Babel, is called an ent and a gigant. And he's, again, famous for making the Tower of Babel, so it's sort of an arcane creation or craft. So I definitely think that's a part of the meaning. And this is actually reflected in, I think Snorri talks about Osgard being built by Jötnar. I believe that's true.
Yeah, no, you are definitely on the ball. You do see that happen quite a lot in Old English and even a couple of Norse texts where, these beings just kind of build incredibly badass things that no one can really explain very well. Like a lot of those poems were written like centuries after the Roman Empire went and died, so like the new English inhabitants would look at it and was like, wow, shit, that's a fucking good building. Some sort of incredibly powerful being must have put it there.
Caesar.
Caesar, a famous Etten.
Yeah. No,
as we all know.
There is, what's interesting, there is an interesting study on this done by, what's his name? His name is
Bob Malarkey.
P.K. Frankus. In the 70s, he did a study of all the places where Enta Jowerk are mentioned outside of the Wanderer, and all of them make reference to Rome. And there seems to be a sort of association that the word has with Romans. I believe Hercules is called an Ent at one point in some text. I'm not remembering the specific text. And he's associated with the Romans. In Solomon and Saturn is called a gigant. So Frankus had this idea that like there was some kind of Roman association with the word. And I think that makes sense if they're usually using them to talk about Roman ruins, that there's some kind of Roman association. Bernard Meese believes that the word Ent might actually come from or be influenced by the Latin word antiquus, meaning old. So that would be another reason to associate the two ideas. Interestingly, in Solomon and Saturn, the Old English poem, Odin, or Woden, if you're an Old English heathen, is called Mercurius Segigant. He is called a gigant in that text. It's in the Noel Codex, I believe.
Yeah, like that in that text, he is just like, who invented letters? Ah, yes, Mercury the fucking giant.
Yes.
Which, like, there's the famous good old interpretatio where they would just constantly roughly equate one god with a Roman deity, and in this period definitely is a sign of learnedness. And so you get, Mercury is very painfully, obviously, Woden, but then you see that association of, gigant. They're calling him a giant.
Because he did some kind of arcane craft, in this case, the runes. Yeah, so there's definitely this idea of, like, if you're called a giant, in big giant quotes, because, again, giant is not the best translation. If you're called an Eoten or an Ent or a gigant, there's some element of craftsmanship or, like, arcane skill associated with the idea. And this also, I want to bring in one other thing. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm talking a lot.
That's what we have
especially in Norse sources, there are quite a few dwarves that are called Jötnars. Regin, especially in Fafnir. Fafnir himself, who was a dwarf before turning into a dragon. But Regin, he calls Fafnir a Jötn. Regin is Fafnir's brother. But then later, after Sigrun drinks the Fafnir's blood and can hear and understand the nut hatches, the birds called Regin a Jötn as they're trying to tell Sigrun to kill him. So what changed about Regin that made him become a Jötn in that moment, I'm not sure. But also in, I think it's Alvismal, or some other source related to Alvismal, Alvis, the dwarf, is also said to resemble a Thurs. So there seems to be some sort of connection with Jötn and Dverga, and it would make sense because most of the great crafts done in Norse mythology are done by dwarves, or Volunteer.
So a situation where, like, this categorizational split may have happened a little later down the line, that they might have been considered, like, similar or the same category of entities, and then it divulged.
I think it's very possible.
That's speculation, as with everything that we do here.
Yeah. We all just speculate at the end of the day. One speculation I have is, so Snorri is a later medieval Christian, sort of trying to make sense of Jötnar's Norse myths. And one thing that medieval Christians, especially in the later Middle Ages, love is categories. They love hierarchies and categories, neat little categories that they can box everything into. Like the Great Chain of Being is a good example of that. But Snorri, another good example is like the Ljósálfar versus the Svartálfar and stuff, the light elves and the dark elves and stuff. That doesn't seem to be a thing before Snorri, but that materializes in Snorri. Medieval Christians love putting things into boxes and categories, and it just doesn't seem like that's what the words originally meant. It seems more like relationships or like roles that were fluid, as are many things in Hebrew.
Yeah, and if we were looking at this from like a theological perspective, like disregarding, like these categories don't make a ton of sense when you think about, well, what is the distinct amount of power to separate a land spirit from a god? Well, that can be a little more clear, although it gets muddied a bit. What is the difference between a Jötn and a god, or an Ettins and a god? And it's like, well, we don't know. It doesn't seem like there's much of a difference, because there are moments where they stand toe-to-toe, and it's not that uneven a thing if it was saying that they're some kind of lesser force, or if to say that they're an evil thing. Well, we've already kind of looked at that and been like, that doesn't make a ton of sense. There are times where we have Asir, speaking in a Norse perspective, like who are referred to as Jotun, like Skathi or Aegir. And so that the categorization that we see from Snorri, if we even look at it from a theological perspective rather than just like words, doesn't make a ton of sense. At least in my brain.
And a lot of times characters from the Eddas kind of get mashed into these categories. I know we didn't want to talk about Loki a whole lot, but I think Loki especially doesn't really fit the category, if you want to put it like that.
I think we were going to mention it at least once this episode and just not talk about Loki. But the conversation is that, Loki doesn't really fit in as an Eddan. Loki is very firmly some form of god. Whether you want to categorize Loki as a whole different tribe of god or get away with the tribalism thing all in the first place, there's not really... Loki doesn't fit.
He doesn't really fit into either box.
That's the title of this podcast. Loki doesn't fit.
Loki doesn't fit.
Sorry.
Well,
yeah, I think that makes sense because if you treat them as boxes, it's not going to work.
Right.
But if you treat them as like roles, like if you have a god, and a god is someone with whom you build like reciprocity repeatedly, and that kind of thing, then Loki's going to be a god. And if you view Loki as opposed to your gods, then they might be more of a yoke. Or if you want to look at some other aspect of Loki that's involved with like primordial things.
But we're not talking about Loki.
Yes, we're going to move on to Loki.
We're talking about Jotun and Eddan. And I think this is a really good segue, now that we've kind of left philology a bit and started talking theology, to discuss, like, Eddan worship, Jotun worship. What does that look like? What is that like? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Does it make theological sense to have a praxis with something that may not have your best interest in mind all the time? Is that even a fair theological claim to have? So many questions.
Sigrun, do you want to explain the Pax Deorum?
Oh, okay, sure.
We're going to dive right, okay.
Because like a lot of my takes kind of revolve around that specific
That's fair.
Sort of kind of idea.
Very briefly, before we go, it's worth noting that this is a controversial subject, because there's a fair few amount of people who don't think that this is like a safe thing to do. Go into the Pax Deorum.
Anyway, so at least like my take and Fishy's take, like they're pretty much based around the idea of like, the aforementioned Pax Deorum, also known as the peace of the gods, the compact of the gods, the deal with the gods, or what have you, because Pax can mean a lot of different things in Latin. So basically, like this was of course originally like Roman words to describe Roman things, and I'm kind of using it a bit more broadly than the Romans might have used it. But like the general gist is that it's sort of like the deal between us silly little mortals and them, the massive Chad immortals. Basically, they make the universe, they make it go round, they do all the little things that make everything exist. And we throw them like neat little gifts every once in a while. We say pretty little words to them, and they look at us like, "You're not bad, little dude," whom I could probably crush with like a little fingernail. I might throw you a little bone or two every once in a while, and it's going to be cool. And you start forming like good relationships with these beings. The basic idea is that the gods, being very, very powerful, they run the universe. We give them gifts because they run the universe. And every once in a while, they might throw us, a nice little something back. That's basically the Pax Deorum in a nutshell.
Yeah, so like under that description, I think just about anything that I would describe as an Ettin would be something that isn't necessarily bound by that kind of agreement. So it doesn't say you can't have reciprocity with Ettins. That is just to say that they aren't necessarily bound to uphold that reciprocity. And going back to Glade's take, I think that's kind of a disagreement I have, is that a destructive force that is good for like proliferation of nature is gonna fall into that category, and that I wouldn't label as an Ettin.
I don't think that's necessarily a disagreement. My categorization is simply like creative versus destructive. It makes no distinction about pax deorum, like whether or not they're bound to reciprocity. I think partially the categorization for Jötnar is a bit arbitrary at times.
Yeah.
Like the example I'll give, because it comes up a lot, is Logi. If you live, in a place that often suffers drought or something, wildfires may be very, very bad. But if you live somewhere like the Pacific Northwest or some other kind of forest where fires are a natural part of the ecology and the upholding of the ecosystem, you're going to have a lot of a different view, right? Which is why I really like localization. That's a whole nother thing. It's very important to me. But I mean, I would still label it as Jötnar simply for the act of destruction, even if it brings creation. Our labeling system isn't quite the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is perfectly valid.
Yeah.
Fuck labels. Hashtag fuck labels. Hashtag burn them.
Should get rid of all the labels.
I'm not opposed to that.
Just worship Blob.
I am opposed to getting rid of all the labels, though, actually. I think I will retract that statement. I think there's use for some labels. Like the distinction between God and spirit, I think is a good label. But that's for another time.
I think I defer a bit just in how I define Heathen. I don't think they're necessarily destructive all the time. I don't think it necessarily means that. I don't want to bring up philology again, but it heavily forms my praxis. So Eoten, like the root probably is from the root for to eat, and it might originally have meant devourer, but whatever suffix that you have to put on the root for eat to make it mean devourer was not like cogently understood in any Germanic language. It wasn't a productive suffix. I don't necessarily want to go into like explaining what that means, other than like it's not a recognizable like eat plus agent noun thing that like transparently means devour. It just comes from the same root, and I think there's some danger in just assuming because something has a root in something that it retains that meaning over time, because words change and language changes. And I just don't think Eoten transparently means devourer or eater. There are Germanic words that mean eater that are built from the word eat plus suffixes that exist in Germanic languages. So I don't necessarily think an Eoten means a devourer or even must be destructive, especially given how, at least in Old English sources, they're more associated with creation than they are destruction.
Do you have a preferred translation of Eoten?
I prefer not to translate it. I prefer to leave it as Eoten. Because I don't think it's a label for a fluid role. I think I would rather just describe what the role is in that time. So for me, I just think that the role more of the time than not is related to building and arcane knowledge, and potentially also destruction too. Like, I mean, Grendel eats people. Notably, when Beowulf talks about fighting him, he calls him a fish. But there's no other time in the poem when he's called a fish other than that one time when Beowulf is talking. But yeah, most of the Eoten stuff we see outside of Grendel and potentially the Jutes is like about creation. Now, I don't want to ignore sources which say very different stuff, but even there you see like Dagod and Note are not their day and night. And I think that definitely fits into like the primordial nature aspect, but I wouldn't call that destruction either. So in terms of reciprocity, I definitely have reciprocity with beings that can be or are labeled Eoten. If we like broaden that out to other terms that get translated giant, like Woden is called a gigant, and I have reciprocity with Woden. So yes, I think it makes sense to have reciprocity with some beings that are called Eoten or Ent, but I would also agree that like there's not necessarily a guarantee that they're going to hold to reciprocity, especially if they're on the more Grendel side of things. And I think ultimately I agree that it just really depends on your relationships that you build with them. I like the Logi example you gave. I like your relationship.
Thanks, I stole it.
Yeah. The relationship with fire. Ultimately decide how you want to build reciprocity or not.
So like even in history, there's a good chance that, these words wouldn't have necessarily been associated with, like, eating.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, definitely. I don't think they were. I really don't think that Eoten to a speaker of Old English means devour. I think it means Eoten.
Ingwine is shifting my whole perspective mid-podcast.
Oh no.
Yeah, it's just a little bit.
Yeah. There is a word etol or eotol which means gluttonous that is from the same root, but that root ends up meaning giant yatuli in Finnish, which is alone.
But if we were like, okay, I'm gonna tangent because that's what this podcast is about. So you're saying like gluttonous, right? And this idea of pax deorum, and like, these are beings that may not be bound to this idea of reciprocity. That you could have gluttonous, it mean like, they may not give back as much. They take more than most, or more than usual.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Well,
that was just impulse brain thought.
Oh no, that makes sense. And the other thing is like, gluttony is a sin in Christianity, but is it necessarily a negative thing? Outside of that, I mean, definitely like overeating, being a bad guest is a bad thing. But the word eotol is just it's verb etan, and then the productive suffix ol, which means like prone to eating. So you're prone to eating a lot, like an Eoten might have been seen. Grendel, again, is our only real, like, individual litmus. He definitely is Eotol, I would think, but he's never called that, to my recollection. I can check that, but...
Hey, guys, guess what? Fishy's audio crashed, because get fucked, idiot. But we're getting back onto the conversation. We had gotten a bit wandering. I don't remember what we were talking about.
We were talking about reciprocity with Eotenas.
Yes.
I will say that, like, the association with building and arcane knowledge and things like that is something that I did not even take into consideration before Ingwine. So, like, that is definitely going to inform my opinion going forward.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I kind of had that sort of thing in the back of my head, but, I guess just having it, like, really, like, spelled out like that, yeah, that's a game changer, honestly.
Yeah, so the thing that's difficult about it is there's sort of like the contention that scholars have that make them like continue to have this sort of like Jötnar and Eotenas are separate from like whatever these beings are that are like arcane builders, even though the word Jötun and Eoten are used for them, is like, oh, originally all these terms meant different things, and we should like be careful about which one it is. For example, maybe Thurs isn't the same thing as Eoten, isn't the same thing as Ent, isn't the same thing as Gigant. And there's like arguments on both sides of this issue. Christopher Bishop has this really in-depth exploration of all these terms, and his conclusion is sort of that like Thurs are the bad ones, and then Eoten, Ent, and Gigant are sort of more interchangeable, although later Eoten and Jötun and Norse get like more of a negative, but not uniformly negative, association from change through time and potential Christian influence from Snorri, etc.
See, I generally would agree with that take. Not knowing anything, like, I would say that there's a big distinction between Thurs and Etten, or Thurs and Jötun.
Yeah. At the same time, though, a lot of the beings that are called one are also called the other at some point.
Right.
So again, I think it's like, even with Thurs, I don't necessarily think it's a race or a category. It's like a role. More of a clearly oppositional one.
Yes. Because like there's a clear distinction between like the role of something like Surtur as compared to the role of going back to Logi. Logi, I don't think is ever called Thurs. Maybe I'm wrong, but there's a clear distinction in like the attribution of malice to intent in Surt. And if that's completely off base, we can cut it.
No, I think that
agree.
makes sense. I don't know if Logi's ever called a Thurs. I know Logi is on a list of Jötnar that I think Snorri writes in Skaldskaparmal, but I may be misremembering. So he's definitely Jötun, at least in that source. But yeah, when it comes to the other terms like Eoten, Ent, Gigant, all of those ones. And we also see like Gugr in Old Norse for like a female giant, quote unquote. That also gets used in Old Norse. That may or may not be related to Gigant. I don't actually think it is. I think a lot of scholars don't think it is. But regardless, the other words, Eoten, Ent, and Gigant, are used adjacently and interchangeably enough for me to feel like, confident in feeling like if we're calling Entas primordial workers and we're calling Eotens primordial swordsmiths, that they're close enough to each other. And also, we see Eotens and Gigants associated as well. So I think that's sort of like the main resistance in scholarship right now is like we should keep these distinct, but I think there's enough overlap to say that maybe we don't. Maybe it's fine that they're interchangeable just because they have different etymologies. Doesn't mean they're not referring to the same kind of thing, especially with how much overlap we see.
Based.
Yeah, that's sort of where my take comes from. So yeah, I definitely, back to the actual, I think, point we were making about theology. Yes, reciprocity with Eotens, maybe even in their role as Eotens as builders, is chill to me. Yeah, maybe not with Thurs, even if you might call one thing a Thurs and an Eoten in another context. When it is a Thurs, you don't necessarily want to be offering to Grendel. I don't know. You do you. Again, Thurs the true people. I see you. I hear you. I support you. That's not me.
I think this is a good point to make a distinction in like why we say the idea of a entity against existence or against order doesn't make a ton of sense, because in essence you're describing an entity that is wanting its own self-destruction.
I think the take, which I don't necessarily agree with, which is they are against the order of the universe, so like against the sun rising in the east and setting in the west and the seasons changing and all that. Not necessarily against existence per se.
Is Daggett against that? The day, the Jotun Daggett, is he against the sunrise?
Right.
I mean, one would assume not.
And
Yeah.
Probably not, just a little bit.
And then
it'd be kind of weird. It's like, hey, I am the day. I don't want to be day anymore. I want to be fish.
Right, and you get to a situation where it's like, things have been going on for a while, and we have no reason to believe that there was ever a time where the sun rose in the west and set in the east. Kind of argues that, even if there are entities out there that are acting against the gods, they're not of the same scale. They're clearly not winning.
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to the Pax Deorum, which is like, if these beings exist, then as long as somebody is giving to the gods, then there's not a whole lot that they can theoretically do, right?
Right.
I have a couple things to say,
Pop
but
off.
I don't want to monopolize, so I'll be quick. One thing is, with regards to how we define being outside of, or opposed to the divine order, or the order of the cosmos, I am in agreement that it doesn't really make sense to be against existence. For me, Thurs, my definition, I know things might be different in Norse sources, but my definition of Thurs comes from an Old English verse in Maxims 2, the Cotton Maxims, where it says, Thurs shalom fenne jewunian ana innan lande, which is that Thurs are found in the fen, alone in the land. And that's something we see with Grendel, is he's not opposed to any kind of cosmic order. He just wants to eat people because he's hungry. And he lives, kind of in the fen with his mom. I guess he's not entirely alone. But Thurs are just kind of out for themselves. That's kind of my take on them. It's like, I wouldn't want reciprocity with them because they're not going to be reciprocal in my sort of praxis.
And there's something to be said about, whoa.
Sorry, that was the end of my water.
No, you're good. You're
Keep
good.
it.
I'm impressed. That was a mighty slurp. There's something to be said. That's gonna be my catchphrase. No, it can't be. It's already Get Fucked Idiot. There's something to be said in that, there is such a massive diversity in human experience. Whether that be through your culture or even just like your own individual, I identify with this, and this. I don't like this. And your neighbor or even your best friend could be like fucking opposite with you. You know, that it makes sense that there is that kind of diversity of identity in the divine, or at least something approaching that. Like, there's no reason to believe either way, so it's a fair assumption either way. There's no evidence against it. I think there is evidence for diversity of divinity, I would argue.
If you believe that the historical people all had the same theology and believed the same beings were of the same order, then I have some PC RAM to sell you over the internet.
Yeah, let me get you the tickets to the pool on the roof.
Got some headlight fluid?
My actual point of this is to say that, like, Fenrir, dog, wants to eat Odin. You might not identify with the stuff that Fenrir does, but if you do, that could be a meaningful source of connection. It could represent something to you that you find valuable, even if you don't care for all the other things, or if you like all of it. But either way, you don't have to like all the things about a deity or a spirit to justify having reciprocity. There are things that need to exist that may not be pleasant, but still deserve thanks for existing, if that makes sense.
No, that's based.
Yeah.
That's super based.
I will say that a lot of worry with people who are more like, what if you're accidentally offering to the wrong kind of being, is that, like Glade said earlier, if there was a chance of that, having major negative repercussions on the order of the universe, we probably would have seen it by now.
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
The people who practice the truth haven't ended the world or brought about Ragnarok yet, so I think if someone wants to offer to a Jötnar, I don't think it'll end the world either.
Right.
Probably not.
And who hasn't wanted to bite Woden's arm at some point?
You're definitely not wrong.
I want to bite something else
old
that's not an
bastard.
arm. And that's the end of that conversation. Don't you ooh that. That's the end of that conversation. Thank you all so much for showing up to another episode of the Heathen Bitches podcast. I've been one of your hosts, Glade. There's been Fish. And Sig.
Sig.
And I guess we're fucking Pokemon now.
I was gonna say that.
Our special guest, Ingwine. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. This is last minute. This is like literally, we were like, hey, we should record something because the hurricane's going to knock you out for a week. I'm like, yeah, let's record something. And Ingwine was there and we're like, actually, hey, you want to come on? So thank you so much. No preparation. Yeah. You've been a champ through all of this. I really appreciate you coming on. You've had really insightful things to say.
Thank you for having me.
Plugs for everything is in the description. Check out Ingwine's stream and get fucked.
Get
idiots.
Fucked. Idiots.
I hope you all have a Grendelicious day.
All right, now do the credit song.
Heathen bitches, yeah.
God's fucking damn it.